Joining me, Anjeanette Damon. She is government accountability reporter in ProPublica's Southwest office, and Byard Duncan, engagement reporter at ProPublica. Their piece, "The Ugly Truth Behind We Buy Ugly Houses," is in ProPublica. It was published about a week ago, May 11th. And there were a couple of follow-up stories on it, too. We'll talk about that because there was a lot to talk about. But welcome to both of you. Anjeanette, let's start with you. Your story is about a specific one of these, I guess you would call them cash buyer companies for homes. Will you just give us a broad overview of that industry and maybe delineate it from, all the other sort of players in that market, like the BlackRocks and others?
Yeah, it's definitely a crowded market. But so Homevestors of America is the company that Byard and I looked at, and it is a franchising company that allows business owners to buy franchises to flip houses. So we're talking about the real estate investors who go and look for quote unquote distressed properties. They'll buy the house for under market value. Sometimes they'll do work and resell it at a higher value. We can get into some of the more complicated ways they do these deals, but they're generally smaller businesses, LLCs, kind of like if you think about a McDonald's franchise, this is a house flipping franchise. And that's different than the big institutional investment firms have been coming up and buying, whole swaths of neighborhoods and often offering, pretty close to market value. These people are out looking for a deal to flip houses.
Byard, why do they need franchises? What is the value if I have the brand "I Buy Ugly Houses" as opposed to I'm just an LLC with cash? Do they get cash from the home office, I guess?
I think Homevestors would say that the most attractive draw of becoming a franchise is the sort of built-in infrastructure that they provide. They have a very large and very sophisticated advertising apparatus that helps novice franchises, people who are new to the house flipping space, find leads. I think that they're also pretty proud of the training that they provide to franchises. And we can kind of get into the finer grain details of what that training teaches exactly. But they're a company that's claim to professionalize the real estate investment industry, and they would say set themselves apart from all the different gurus and, like you mentioned, the BlackRocks and places like that.
As you're telling me the things that the company provides to their franchisees, those are all the bullet points of the problems that you found, right? When you talk about the advertising and the targeting of where you're getting it and the approach that they use to close these deals, those are the two big elements that seem to be problematic. Anjeanette, why don't you sort of fill in the details of what I'm saying there?
Yeah, the branding is exactly what you're getting if you're buying a franchise, right? If you're going to McDonald's, what kind of a hamburger you're getting. Homevestors spends a lot of money. Well, specifically, their franchise owners spend an awful lot of money on this advertising. So that if you have even an inkling that you might want to sell your home, they might be the first company that you think of because of that brand and all of the investment in that brand. Where their approach has become problematic, when you talk to Homevestors, they'll say they target their advertising around particular houses that would be a good investment. But what we found is that those houses often are owned by people in vulnerable or even desperate situations. And beyond just targeting a particular type of house, an older house, a house that the owner probably has a significant amount of equity in, a smaller house, and usually in kind of that mid-price point range. They also direct marketing. They teach their franchise owners to build relationships with people that might have contact with others in vulnerable situations. So nursing home administrators, or divorce lawyers or probate lawyers, in order to reach those people who might be in a position to need to sell their house quickly.
Byard, the idea of a homeowner having lots of equity, presumably that's so that why is that of value to We Buy Ugly Homes?
I think it makes it just a more attractive sale for the homeowner, because they're not sort of making the calculation of how much equity they still have to pay off. And the whole point basically of going after these homes and trying to buy them at a discount is that you're able to offer somebody perhaps a price that looks quite impressive to them at the time if they don't fully understand the value of their home. And they're not perhaps thinking in the back of their mind of how much of their home's value they still have to pay off.
So in other words, if I bought the home in 1965 for $24,000 or something, and I still owe, and maybe I took a second mortgage out or something, but if I owe a significant portion of that, the $40,000 they offer me today would set off a red flag. But if I'm completely paid off and I have had no reason to assess the value of my home in the past, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years, then, whatever they offer me may sound good. And that's how they're getting there's two different things it seems like they're taking advantage of. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Byard, but one is just sort of like asymmetrical market awareness. And then the other one is like people either in desperate situations or not with their full faculties.
That's correct. Yeah. And to start, there's an even more dramatic example in our reporting. We highlighted the case of an elderly woman outside of Los Angeles who had bought her home in 1961. And I think was presented by a Homevestors franchise with a price of $275,000. The home was paid off, and $275,000 is a lot of money. The home ultimately was worth about $510,000. Meanwhile, this person, had dementia. Her family tried to cancel the sale. The litigation dragged on for years and years, and it's still going. That began in 2016. To your point about information asymmetry, you're absolutely right about that. People get bombarded with these flyers. Sometimes they get phone calls, text messages, and to the untrained person, somebody who's not tremendously savvy in real estate, somebody who approaches you about buying or selling your home, you might logically infer that they're some sort of licensed real estate agent if they're interested in your home and interested in transacting over property. But the fact of the matter is there's a huge constellation of real estate investors out there, Homevestors being arguably the largest player, of people who aren't licensed and whose duties to the people that they interact with, the homeowners that they interact with, are a lot different than licensed real estate agents' duties are.
Anjeanette, why do we license real estate brokers?
I think, that's a really good question. It's a fundamental question. A person's house in real estate is often the largest investment, most people's largest investment of their lifetime. A real estate agent is representing the buyer or representing the seller, in many cases, both the buyer and the seller. And so there's an entire regulatory scheme around that to ensure that real estate agents act ethically. Now, there's obviously unethical real estate agents out there that have preyed upon homeowners as well as unethical behavior isn't necessarily contained to real estate investors. But because there's that regulatory apparatus, there's a licensing board, there's a commission that you can go to complain and say, look, I think I was ripped off by this individual. And then there's a board that can investigate that and police that behavior. With wholesaling or house flipping real estate investment, that regulatory apparatus really doesn't exist. And when you talk about the fiduciary responsibility, that's fundamental to a real estate agent's relationship with the client. They have the responsibility that's protected in law to represent your interest to their best of their ability and try and get you the best deal that they can. A real estate flipper or investor, it's sheer capitalism out there. They're out there to make money, to get a profit off the house. And most of them are going to be very upfront about that. They're telling you, look, you're going to be trading a top price, top dollar for convenience and speed, and they get you focused on maybe that dollar amount that you want rather than what the actual value of the house is. And they're trained to the training manual uses the term find the pain. If you can find the pain of the individual, you have a better chance of buying the house, is what the manual says. And that ranges from, we spoke to one former franchise owner who said the pain of the seller that he was interacting with was that his mother was dying in hospice, and the only way that he could get funds to travel across the country to see her was to sell his house. So then they're focusing in on the dollar amount that they need to solve whatever problem is before them, rather than really getting a good idea of what their house is worth and looking at the other options out there.
So, Byard, we can talk about if there's been any attempts to regulate this space, but the societal benefit, as it were, like I can understand like why we have real estate brokers. It's because people don't sell their homes often, and you have a trained professional who might go out there and know the best way to do it, maximize your price, it's like any other broker. And I guess, the value of having the existence of cash buyers, of these type of companies, is that they are ready to do a transaction quickly when you're in some form of duress. But the fact that there's no regulation means that people can't really assess whether they're in a position of duress that requires someone like this to show up at their house.
Absolutely. And so maybe it's helpful for me to give you an example of when this system works really well. So say you're in Brooklyn and you have a relative, a father and mother in Idaho that just passed away, and their house was in tremendous disrepair. You have 5 brothers and sisters, and you and your brothers and sisters understand that you could have somebody go out there, kind of sort through the paperwork, fix up the house, maybe hire a contractor, spend time in Idaho making sure the contractor was doing the job correctly. And you would get, let's say, $20,000 more than you would if you went with a cash buyer. Maybe you and your siblings just say, this is not worth $20,000. You have a really busy job. You have 4 kids, that kind of thing. There is an absolutely legitimate niche for cash home buying in the United States. The problem is that the regulatory framework for making sure that there's not a lot of bad behavior in this space is just almost completely absent. There are a few examples here and there at the state level, at the city level of people trying to crack down or trying to just get their heads around how to regulate cash buying, specifically wholesaling. And wholesaling is when you basically buy somebody's home and then you flip it without really even doing any improvements. You basically sell the contract to another investor. There are regulations around wholesaling in Oklahoma, in Arkansas, at the city level, Philadelphia and Atlanta, but it is a patchwork. And even state by state, they're not looking for the same things. They're not pushing the same regulations. Some places have a cooling off period. Some places allow for penalties if you ask somebody to stop sending you flyers and they don't. There definitely is a need for sort of more unified regulation state by state, especially in really hot housing markets.
Anjeanette, what has been the encumbrance to that type of regulation? Is there a cash buyer lobby? Is it like, I would imagine it's like some of these big hedge funds maybe would have the ability to sort of inhibit that type of legislation, or is it just simply that the people who are being preyed upon are just, they have no political cachet, and I imagine like you're talking about already stressed group of a cohort of people, and you have the main story about Corinne Casanova. Her son ends up really pursuing it, but it's unique enough that is the through line of your story. So is it just a matter of there's just not enough like awareness of this, or that the people who have been more or less injured by this are we don't hear from them?
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of the reasons. We have looked, there have been examples of Homevestors and other industry players trying to push back against regulation in specific areas. But I think, one of the more difficult things about this is the lack of transparency kind of around real estate in general. It took us a year to investigate this company, and the lack of transparency, the inability to go into a market and say, be able to pull how many transactions were done by Homevestors franchises, and to identify sellers. A lot of sellers maybe didn't even know that they could have gotten a better deal. They don't even know that maybe they were taken advantage of. So yeah, there's no kind of cohort around that, but the lack of transparency makes it really difficult to tell the stories of people who were taken advantage of, and to bring attention to this area. And there is a large industry around keeping that data confidential. There are large clearinghouses that charge an awful lot of money to real estate investors and others who are able to go, county by county to pull real estate documents, deed recordings and Liz Pendens, and then sell that information to real estate investors, and not really the average person. So it's a difficult industry to investigate.
Well, I probably should have said this up front. I mean, you guys spoke to literally dozens of former franchise owners, dozens of homeowners who have sold to those franchises. And I mean, it's an amazing piece of reporting, and it's also fun to watch their response, and they're almost like their rolling response to the piece, where you and your continued reporting as you capture their response to your piece, because a lot of it is they don't want people to read this online, because they don't want people to have some level of scrutiny when they're about to make these sales. And you tell stories of folks who, some have dementia, some, like you say, I mean, I think we've covered at least the broad strokes. Give me your sense, Byard, if you think that there is there any sort of concerted push to at least like regulate this on a national level? Could it be done on a national level? What would be the easiest fix for this, other than going state by state or county by county and imposing type of regulations?
One thing that was so surprising as we were spending a year reporting this was just sort of the dearth of experts and academics and even lawmakers who this was on their radar. Now, a couple different potential reasons for that. I think a lot of advocates are rightly focused on people who don't own, who rent, because I think there's an assumption that if you own a home, there's a degree of wealth that you sort of inherently have, and you're perhaps not viewed as in need as somebody who rents and lives day to day. Another thing that really surprised us too was that the leading experts in this space, in how to regulate this space, are at the state level. I think that, we spoke to a member of Oklahoma's Real Estate Commission who was instrumental in passing regulations in Oklahoma around wholesaling. We spoke to a gentleman in Philadelphia who has studied this extensively. There's scholars at Drexel University. There's another woman at whose name is Sarah Mancini, who I think is one of the few experts who is really studying this issue of wholesaling and equity theft in earnest. I think Probably like I said, I think the main reason that that this has flown sort of under the radar is that there's a lot of attention on the big hedge funds who are buying in volume, and like Anjeanette mentioned, maybe perhaps a little bit closer to market value, but kind of snapping up what feel like whole neighborhoods. And then also this issue of folks just perceiving, perhaps wrongly, that if you own a home, you're kind of set in a way that somebody who rents is not. And we found that's just not the case always.
Well, Anjeanette Damon, government accountability reporter in ProPublica Southwest office. Byard Duncan, engagement reporter at ProPublica. The piece is The Ugly Truth Behind We Buy Ugly Houses, and 5 stories of lives upended after dealing with the We Buy Ugly Houses company. And Homevestors praised ProPublica's reporting and then tried to bury it. And then also a very helpful piece that you both wrote about if you're looking to sell your home for cash, read this first. All of them we will link at majority.fm. Really, all of them worth reading. Fascinating and really, really impressive reporting. Thanks so much for coming on and talking about it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.